How did Britain lose the American Revolution? Animated History by Armchair Historian. Well, as far as I know, as I am not an American historian, I know certainly probably more than definitely more than the average person, as I am a historian. But I'd say I I passably know enough of the American Revolution. It's not my focus point, but as an American studying history at American universities, you learn about the Revolution, and also it is one of the most significant world events in history because of what America would become. Anyways, how Britain lost? Variety of reasons. One, it was kind of like their Vietnam, because it was not a popular war back home. They didn't really want to fight it. They didn't care much. And like literally all of Europe was against Britain in the war as well. France, Spain, and Portugal, I believe. I think Portugal was also helping the colonies. I know Spain and France directly were, and I think even the Dutch as well. There's just so many reasons. Like you could easily spend hours upon hours explaining each and every reason why Britain lost this war. But obviously had there not been intervention from European powers, the American Revolutionary Army most likely would have starved and just died or something, or just lost in all of its battles. So let's go ahead and just dive right in and hear these answers.
The following account is from Lieutenant J. Waller of the 1st Battalion Royal Marines at Bunker Hill.
We're going into Bunker Hill.
Quick march!
2 companies of the 1st Battalion of Marines and part of the 47th Regiment were the first that mounted the breastwork.
Don't fire until you see the whites of their
And you will
eyes,
not be
men.
displeased when I tell you that I was with those 2 companies.
I like the background noises
Who
they've got
drove
going.
their bayonets into all that opposed them. Nothing could be more shocking than the carnage that followed the storming of this work. We gained a complete victory.
Boom! The cannonball.
The Battle of Bunker Hill was one of the many gruesome battles of the American Revolution, a war that lasted a total of 8 years, approximately the same length as the American Civil War, Spanish-American War, and Mexican-American War combined. It's clear then that in many ways the American Revolution was a war of attrition, but unlike prevailing belief, the war was not won simply because the British would fight in lines and the Americans would just hide in the bushes. All of America's most decisive victories were won in a conventional manner. But it was in the way that the Americans engaged the British, fighting on their own terms, that allowed them to outlast their enemy. I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian, and today we'll be evaluating the advantages and disadvantages that both sides faced,
The Americans
which
still
ultimately
lost
decided the
a
outcome
lot
of
of
the war.
battles in this
Before
war.
we get to the video, I highly recommend you guys check out the channel Japsby on YouTube. He's got a lot of videos on all different wars throughout history.
In 3
Today
minutes.
he released a video on the Haitian Revolution.
Oh, he's
I'll
got a
actually be
video on the
narrating one
Welsh?
of his videos this month,
Glindwer-
so be sure to
Glind-
subscribe
Glind-
and check it out.
Glindwer-
Links are in the description below.
Glindver.
To begin this topic, we'll be comparing 3 categories in order to evaluate who fielded the better army, starting with
The
leadership.
British.
The most notable American leader is, of course, George Washington. Appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army in 1775, Washington was quick to take action. He successfully forced the British garrison out of Boston in 1776, but was defeated and almost captured that same year in New York City. Still, his tactical innovation and strategic prowess are proven in the battles of Trenton, Princeton, and Yorktown, to name a few. The next American general is Horatio Gates. Responsible for the American victories at Saratoga, Gates gained recognition early on. But just as Gates is remembered for Saratoga, he's also remembered for the major defeat suffered at the Battle of Camden, which was a huge blow to American morale. As a consequence, he was replaced by the much more competent Nathaniel Greene, a favorite of George Washington, who eventually defeated the British in the South. Finally, there's Benedict Arnold, who captured Fort Ticonderoga, a crucial position in upstate New York. This action would soon be overshadowed, however, by his betrayal of the American cause in the middle of the war.
Yep.
On the British
yep.
side, we have three significant commanders. The first is William Howe, the man who led the British to their Pyrrhic victory at Bunker Hill. After the battle, he replaced Thomas Gage as commander-in-chief of the British forces in America. Howe would go on to successfully capture Philadelphia, but because of poor communication, this meant that the army of John Burgoyne, another British commander, would be trapped without support and eventually forced to surrender. Shortly after
Goofed
Howe's
Burgoyne.
blunder, he was
I like
replaced
that.
with Sir Henry Clinton in 1778, who would remain in the position of commander-in-chief for the majority of the war. The last British commander I'd like to mention is Charles Cornwallis, who was mostly active in New England and the Middle Colonies in the initial stages of the war, but was later reassigned to the Southern Theater, where he made great progress in Georgia and the Carolinas before overextending and being forced to surrender at Yorktown. From this, we can infer that the British generals tended to be more experienced and better educated, although this was negated by the presence of other factors, such as the sheer distance from Great Britain, which delayed the delivery of troops and supplies.
Correct.
In the case of American generals, most of their experience came from the 7 Years' War.
George
This
Washington
would
fought
give
against the
them
French in the
superior
7 Years' War, but
knowledge of the
received their help in
terrain.
their
Their
American
main
Revolution.
disadvantage would be the lack
Correct.
of organization. In terms of pure tactical ability, American commanders held a slight advantage, as evident in the cunning victories at Trenton and Cowpens. The next category we'll evaluate.
Yeah, but didn't we lose the majority of the battles? And the battles that we did win weren't necessarily the most decisive of victories. And it wasn't really until the Battle of York, like, certainly some American victories were definitely decisive and stunning victories, but I don't think they were. I think I don't know how to say this, because definitely these generals were definitely skilled, right? It's not like we had shitty generals, but they weren't as good as I think this video is kind of saying here. This is an older video by Armchair Historian, so I'm not going to blame him at all, because I think a couple years ago as well, I would have probably said the same things that he's saying here, or made the same like kind of assumptions, right? Especially when a video is only 11 minutes long, right? You can't do the right amount of research for it. So it takes a bit. But I think I'd give that point to the British, personally. I just think they had so many factors against them: the distance, communication issues, it not being their home territory. I think that's what, screwed over the British. Whereas obviously the American generals, on the other hand, knew the territory. So I guess, yeah, on a tactical point of view, the Americans would get the advantage because they understand the land better.
Is troop discipline and tactics.
Oh, the British
If you've
fucking
seen
have
any
that.
TV documentary on the American Revolution, it's usually stated directly that the Americans were superior in their combat abilities in almost every way just because they utilized guerrilla tactics. And while there is some truth to this, it was the Continental Army that won battles and the irregular troops who retreated from those battles. It's also said that along with the Minutemen, the Riflemen were game changers on the battlefield, but as stated in Battles of the American Revolutionary War 1775 to 1781 by W.J. Wood, at full strength, the Riflemen could muster some 960 men, less than 3% of the Army's total numbers. I can say confidently then that it's simply untrue that American rifles and militia won the war. The American militiamen were untrained, under-equipped, and most importantly, unobligated to fight. Oftentimes they would simply leave and go home if they didn't want to fight anymore. A
Correct.
British redcoat, meanwhile, could fire much more regularly and was more often than not equipped with a bayonet, making for devastating charges. Lastly, the British would always have a detachment of elite grenadiers on the right flank, which would often break the American line, especially if the American forces were composed of militia, as seen at the Battle of Camden.
Fire!
Ooh, nice smoke
Line
effect.
and load.
I like it.
The last
Yeah,
category
that's
we'll
just
evaluate
hands
is
down that goes to the
equipment
British.
and supplies. Infantry equipment was the logistical priority for both the
Neither side wins this one. The Americans were starving. Actually, I'd give it to the British. The British may have had to travel long distances, but the Americans were still starving in their own homeland a lot of the time, whereas the British were relatively well supplied throughout the entire colonies.
British and American armies. The British were armed with the Brown Bess, a .71 caliber flintlock musket. The Americans, on the other hand, were mainly equipped with the .69 caliber Charleville musket, which was supplied by the French. Both sides did utilize riflemen in the war, but of course the Americans were better known for it, wielding the infamous Kentucky long rifle, as seen here. We can say then that the only significant differences between each side's army was that of supply. The British supply lines during the majority of the war were stretched very thin, causing them to stay close to ports to receive reinforcements and foodstuffs.
True.
This constraint also prevented the British armies from pursuing the American forces inward. Even when the British could use the ports they captured, getting resupplied and reinforced took 1 to 4 months. Despite Britain's logistical constraints, the Americans were in no better a position. Such can be seen at Washington's Valley Forge encampment,
Correct.
where about 2,000 of his 12,000 soldiers died to malnutrition and disease. Losses like
Was
this
that
were
many?
commonplace in the
Damn.
Continental Army, at least early on. For this reason, the British held a slight advantage in supply.
Okay, good.
So with
Came
all
to the
of
same
this
conclusion
said,
I did.
the British were better disciplined, well-equipped, and led by somewhat competent commanders, whereas the Americans lost more battles, were short on supplies, undertrained, and only compensated by a few notable commanders. How then did the British lose? Well, we're forgetting 2 crucial categories: war support and grand strategy. Let's start with war support. The cause of the Patriots had significant support in the colonies. The idea of political independence was highly appealing, much more than that of loyalty to the crown, especially in the North, where British financial restrictions hurt American merchants. As the war continued, the British were increasing.
I would say that the support for the war was in the hands of the people that mattered most, and that would be in the wealthy mercantile class. It was not, I do not believe it was really all too popular among the agricultural people. I think especially in the South, I don't think there was much support. And that's why, one, we had to allow the South to keep their slaves. One of the reasons. There are other reasons as well, as there being members of Congress that are members of the founding fathers that wanted to keep their slaves as well. But one of the reasons, at least how I've learned it, so correct me if I'm wrong, if you understand the American Revolution far better than I, please do let me know. The South needed to be given shit to be convinced to support the Patriot side, which was they needed the U.S. Capitol to be closer to the South, right? So we needed D.C. and also needed they needed their slaves. They wanted to keep their slaves, right? They needed to be convinced to stay loyal. Whereas it was, I think at the beginning, it was primarily a northern war. It was like Massachusetts, that kind of place, those areas, New England area that really were fighting the war. It wasn't really much of the South, at least from my understanding. You're not taught about much of fighting in the South until, what was it, Nathaniel Greene wins the South, right? But yeah, the support for the American war was in the mercantile class. The British did not have the support, as I said in the beginning. And then war goals. Correct? I'm going to predict it. The United States war goals were, of course, just to kick the British out. They needed to defend and attrition the British. The British needed to conquer and suppress the rebels and such. And they did not have... Their generals, I think, were disagreeing on their aims on the British side.
Seen as foreign invaders, and the actions of commanders such as Banastre Tarleton helped support this belief. Despite this, the Patriots were never fully able to control the entirety of the American countryside, as there was a strong core of loyalist supporters of Great Britain.
Yep, as I was saying about
Internationally,
the
the American
loyalists.
cause was more popular, with the French, Spanish, and Dutch all supporting the Patriot cause.
Okay.
Though it was more out of a desire to oppose British hegemony than out of appreciation for Republican ideals.
Yes.
Some notable figures who really helped America reform their army were Baron von Steuben and Marquis de Lafayette.
Yes.
Something I find really interesting is that the largest battle of the American Revolution was actually fought at Gibraltar, and though the British came out victorious, it's just one of many examples of how overextended Britain became as America received more and more international support. Indeed, the British saw virtually no foreign support during the Revolution.
The Kingdom of Hanover was in a personal union under Great Britain, making it the only European country to join the war on Britain's side, not including mercenaries. Huh. Interesting.
With regards to strategy, the Americans had the edge compared to the British,
Yes.
even if it changed as the war continued. At the outbreak of hostilities, the American army fought in a conventional manner, engaging the British on their own terms, and even launching some attacks into Britain's Canadian territories. Needless to say, most of these attacks failed, severely crippling American military strength. The British strategy initially was to secure the cities of New England, thinking that once the capital of the Revolution fell, so too would the morale of the Patriots. Although they did capture most of New England, they were poorly coordinated. This could be seen when William Howe left Burgoyne in upstate New York to face the Continental Army while he captured Philadelphia. He underestimated the strength of the Americans, and what followed was one of the largest British military disasters of the time, as Burgoyne lost his whole army and was captured. Howe also found that even though Philadelphia was occupied, the Americans hadn't lost their will to fight. After realizing his strategy was not fit for the Americas, he resigned and left Henry Clinton in charge. The second phase of the war took place in the South, after Clinton realized that the North was too heavily populated with patriots. Washington and Nathaniel Greene had revised their strategy after destroying the British at Saratoga, but unfortunately, Horatio Gates learned nothing. Gates engaged General Cornwallis in the South in an open-pitched battle and lost a huge portion of his men, after which he was relieved by Nathaniel Greene. Cornwallis and his staff, emboldened by their victory, continued to push through Georgia and North Carolina. Learning from his previous mistakes, however, Greene slowly pulled Cornwallis away from his supply lines by continuously drawing him into small skirmishes, until Cornwallis was forced to abandon his campaign and retreat to the port of Yorktown, where he was trapped by the French Navy, with Washington expecting him. By viewing the American Revolution as simply a fight between the British soldier and American soldier, all evidence would point to a British victory. But when you factor in that the Americans had help from tens of thousands of foreign soldiers and supplies and were employing brilliant new strategies, you can see that the Americans were able to hold on until the British lost their will to fight. Even though Cornwallis was captured and lost his whole army, the British could have sent another one, but they didn't, because support for the war was virtually gone. And it is for all of these reasons combined that the British suffered such a defeat. Thanks for watching.
Thank you for making the video. Yeah, this was a pretty good video. Definitely covered what it needed to in the 11 minutes. I don't think they needed to really expand. I don't think Griffin here needed to talk more on many other points. I think definitely could have benefited from expanding on certain points, right? History always benefits from further expansion, right? You know, gives better understanding, but I don't think that was necessary for this video. I think what they did here in this video was just fine. Yeah, I said all I needed to say throughout the video. So I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to leave a suggestion down below for what you want to see me react to next, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.